So why don't we get started? I'm Jamie Dernan. I'm the co-founder of the foundation along with Andrew W. Marshall. Before we start, I just want to let people know that if you have questions for the speakers today, please email them to the address in the chat, which is info@andrewwmarshallfoundation.org. So with that, I want to welcome you to the Incalculable Element, Ancient Innovations for Modern Security Problems. This is part of the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation's ongoing webinars featuring our new voices who are thinking about the implications of the long-term competitions that the United States is facing and will continue to face in the future. Today we hear from Emily Davis. She's the Andrew W. Marshall Paper Prize winner on creative bursts and intellectual outliers. Emily is a postdoctoral or predoctoral fellow at the Clemens Center at the University of Texas, Austin. She's working on her dissertation in political theory, where she's examining the ambiguous concept of charismatic leadership through works by thinkers such as Weber, Xenophon, and Plutarch. And once I saw that, I understand why she might have picked who she picked as her subject for the paper. We launched this experiment on creative bursts and intellectual outliers by asking three questions. The first was, how does creativity among peer groups come about? How is it fostered and how is it maintained? The second question is, what is an intellectual outlier? There's a lot of questions, a terrific paper written by Jim March, Mio Jay, and Andrew Marshall published in 2015 that talked about intellectual outliers. And I would be less than honest if I didn't say that gave us some ideas about, how we wanted to, in what direction we wanted to go. And the third question is, what conditions foster these creative bursts among individuals and organizations, especially in bureaucracies writ large? So Emily's response explores the insights from Thucydides' discussion of how the Sicilians, inspired by the unconventional guidance of the general Hermocrates, facilitated Sparta's defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. It's actually, if you've read the Peloponnesian War, it's terrific. The fact that Emily was able to, to take this case study and look at it, and just by reading her paper, it reminded me that it really does remain salient for modern audiences, because it shows us a non-traditional leadership suited to today's security problems. We're proud to give Emily this platform to share her work and her ideas about how Hermocrates, in Emily's words, a less eye-catching figure than some of the famous leaders more readily studied, is an intellectual outlier worth examining. Hermocrates joins the ranks of other outliers, from the most prominent like Thucydides to the quieter ones like our founder, maybe even the quietest one that I know, Jim Mattis, who actually wrote a terrific note about Emily's paper. Delivering opening remarks and moderating the discussion with Emily will be Dr. Jesse Ausubel, one of the Foundation's advisors, an environmental scientist and a director of the program for human environment at the Rockefeller University in New York. Before we get started, I'll note that this session is being recorded and is on the record. So Jesse, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Emily, for this opportunity to emphasize that your own paper is a wonderful outlier. Well, let me just begin by saying, of course, one of the most basic questions is, what is an outlier? And context, of course, matters greatly in that regard. One can be an outlier in a market, selling high or selling low, or with a new product. One can be an outlier in a hierarchy or a bureaucracy, participating or not. One can be an outlier in a golf club by the way one dresses or performs, or in a cult or sect, or religious groups. We often hear about people either joining or leaving particular types of groups. One can be an outlier in a huge football crowd. Emily is in Austin, Texas, and 100,000 people or so go to UT Austin football games. And what would it mean to be an outlier there. Momentarily with Emily, we'll be going to Syracuse, not Syracuse, New York, but Syracuse, Sicily, and to the world of Sicily and Athens and the Peloponnesian War. But let me just briefly mention one other outlier, a very famous one, Leonardo da Vinci, who lived about 500 years ago. And one of the things that's interesting about Leonardo is that we all regard him as an outlier for his extraordinary achievements in many domains of practice and thought. But in reading his work, one sees that he saw himself also as an outlier. He wrote backwards, he encrypted all kinds of things, and you felt that he almost felt like he was a person from Mars landing in Tuscany. And so I think one of the interesting questions also is how do our perceptions of either individuals or groups or organizations that we from the outside say may have this status, how does that compare with the view from the inside? If you see yourself as an outlier, does that in some way reflexively change your own behavior? Of course, there are questions. One can be an outlier by being too early or too late. We, of course, are especially interested in outliers who have influence, who in that sense succeed, more like a Leonardo, not a one-hit wonder, let's say like Los Del Rio, who had the big hit, the Macarena, but didn't do anything more. But we're more interested in the Beatles or Grandmaster Flash or people who begin as outliers with innovations, but then have influence. So, Emily, take us back to 400 BC and the island of Sicily and traffic between Athens and Syracuse. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for that introduction. Thank you to Jamie as well. And special thanks to Stephanie and Lily at the Marshall Foundation for putting all of this together in such a wonderful and helpful way. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here. I'm delighted to have you all here, and it's an honor to be able to talk to you a little bit about Thucydides and Hermocrates today. So first, I'll just set the stage a little bit with our modern situation. And of course, it's no secret that the United States is up against some unanticipated challenges when it comes to our national security. Uppermost in many people's minds, of course, is the recent meteoric rise of China, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the threatening alliance between China and Russia as presented in their joint statement at the 2022 Olympics. And as the war in Ukraine goes on, so does the fear of nuclear escalation. But this problem, while important, is far from our only one. There are also the ever-increasing advancements in areas like drone technology and artificial intelligence that promise to change and already are changing the landscape of military combat. The ever-increasing complexity of military operations as they become more diverse and geographically distributed, and the ever-increasing hyperpartisanship of our domestic political situation, which, as many scholars argue, weakens our ability to coordinate and respond effectively to external threats. These many volatilities of our current situation have prompted military experts and political scientists alike to warn that US strategy needs to change with the times, that we can't just keep doing what we have been doing in previous conflicts, expecting the traditional methods to work. And this involves reflecting seriously on difficult themes, on our own place in the global order, and on the possibility that US hegemony is not guaranteed and will not last forever. And naturally, we won't be able to do this effectively without leaders who are willing and able to adapt to the changing times, to embody and encourage the kind of reflection and inventiveness that our circumstances require. But while it's easy enough to just say that, it's much harder to envision just what such leadership might look like in practice, which is why I turned to history for help, specifically Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, which took place from 431 to 404 BC, with Athens and Sparta as the primary opponents. And in particular, I examined Thucydides' discussion of how Hermocrates, a general from the Sicilian city of Syracuse, made his fellow Sicilians instrumental in helping Sparta defeat Athens and eventually winning the war. Now, this overview raises a few questions. First, why was Sicily, an island off the coast of Italy, important in this war between Athens and Sparta? Well, the answer is that the Athenians had wanted to conquer Sicily for some time, not only because its size, location, fertility, and accessibility would help them in the war, but also because all these factors simply made Sicily an attractive prize for the Athenians to subdue. And in 415 BC, about halfway through the war, the Athenians did try to conquer Sicily, but ended up failing spectacularly, largely due to some actions of the Sicilians that were suggested and orchestrated by Hermocrates. Of course, all this leads into the second question, which is who on earth was this general Hermocrates? Because, as Jamie mentioned in his introduction, it's definitely true that Hermocrates is a much less studied and much less celebrated figure than, say, Pericles or Alcibiades or Themistocles, the names we think of when we think of Thucydides' history. And Thucydides doesn't tell us much about his background other than that he's from Syracuse. But I argue that Hermocrates deserves as careful an examination as any of these other figures, not least because he exemplifies the untraditional, adaptable kind of leadership that our national security landscape so sorely needs today. So to discuss my argument a little further, in the paper, I maintain that at a time when the Sicilians, the undisputed underdogs in their conflict with Athens, would seem to need nothing but exhortations to confidence and power, Hermocrates instead chose to highlight human limitations, the changeability of political and strategic affairs, and the power of chance in his speeches to his fellow citizens. And by doing so, he allowed the Sicilians to pause and to really reflect on their traditional customs, strategies, and alliances, and to recognize that many of these customs and strategies and alliances were not as unchangeable, were not as set in stone as the Sicilians had come to believe. So just to give a couple examples, in his speech at the Sicilian city of Gela in 425 BC, Hermocrates convinced members of the various Sicilian factions who for years had seen one another as natural enemies to shift their perspective in light of the larger Athenian threat, to recognize that despite their differences, they possessed a common interest and a common purpose when it came to fending off the dangers of Athenian imperialism. And later on in the war, while leading his fellow Syracusans in battle against the Athenians, Hermocrates encouraged them not to fall into the easy trap of thinking that Athens had always been and always would be a great naval power. In other words, that naval power was the natural possession of Athens and could never be used as effectively by anyone else. Hermocrates argued that the Sicilians, if they freed themselves of this view, could challenge the Athenians at sea and succeed. And he was right. Now, these are just a couple examples of Hermocrates' leadership. But as I maintain in my paper, the common thread that runs through all of them is his emphasis on the fact that when it comes to politics, war, and grand strategy, it's all too easy for us to become overly comfortable and overly confident in our traditional methods and patterns. To believe that a certain strategy or alliance or enmity must be natural and permanent just because it's been long-lasting. That a certain power must continue to be strong forever just because it's been strong for decades. And that a certain plan must succeed because it accords with our established notions of morality and justice. And although he placed a strong emphasis on this fact when speaking to the Sicilians, Hermocrates was able to do this without blaming them for their shortcomings or denigrating their customs and beliefs. He simply opened their minds to new perspectives on themselves, their abilities, and their alliances, allowing them to innovate strategically in ways they had not been able to do before. Now, to make Hermocrates' leadership stand out even more, Thucydides clearly contrasts it with that of the Athenians. Thucydides demonstrates that the Athenians lacked the ability that Hermocrates so forcefully exhibited. The ability to know their limits, to accept that the future was uncertain, and to truly understand that their fortunes were always subject to change. Thucydides says, in fact, that because the Athenians had done so well in the war thus far, they had become convinced that they were stronger than anyone who might oppose them. That, in fact, they, quote, had a right, unquote, not to be opposed. They thought they could, quote, achieve the possible things and the impracticable things equally, unquote, no matter their number of resources. This attitude became most evident throughout the Athenians' attempt to conquer Sicily, which I mentioned earlier, which they leaped to undertake despite the many factors, such as the plague that had recently swept through Athens, weakening its forces considerably, and the difficulty of attacking and maintaining power over Sicily, that made it ill-advised and eventually caused it to fail spectacularly. It was this attitude, Thucydides indicates, that caused the Athenians, after being roundly defeated by the Sicilians under the guidance of Hermocrates, to lose the Peloponnesian War soon afterward. Now, as I argue in my paper, the case of Hermocrates' leadership and the contrast with that of the Athenians can teach us a great deal about the kind of innovation and adaptability we need throughout the US security landscape today. If we are going to meet our many challenges effectively, we would do well to take a warning from the Athenians about untrammeled overconfidence and a lesson from Hermocrates and the Sicilians about the open-mindedness and creativity that serious reflection on our own limitations and biases can create. Of course, in the spirit of reflecting on our limitations, I'll acknowledge the limits of this study. I've considered Hermocrates' leadership only as it applies to his circumstances, time period, and culture, and as it relates to the current American situation. The question of its overall generalizability needs further examination. Furthermore, in this paper, I analyze only a few portions of Thucydides. Many more comprehensive comparisons could be made between Hermocrates and other Thucydidean leaders, and undoubtedly, many other lessons about innovative leadership could be drawn from other Thucydidean cases. And to broaden out even more, useful comparisons could surely also be made between Hermocrates' leadership and cases in other disciplines not showcased in my paper. However, I trust and hope that this particular case is still able to teach us valuable and important lessons about the kind of leadership we need today in our current national security situation. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. I'll end my remarks here. I very much look forward to your questions, and Jesse, I look forward to our conversation.
Emily, thank you so much. It's a fascinating subject and a fascinating bringing to bear of evidence from the classics and from the humanities to the social sciences. Let me follow up on the question about a little bit more about Hermocrates himself. Much of what we know about Hermocrates is from Thucydides. There are sparse other sources. Do we know whether he was a serial outlier? And do we know if he perceived himself as an outlier?
That's a really good question, Jesse. I would say, with regard to whether Hermocrates was a serial outlier, I mean, in the sense that he was, at least from what we see in Thucydides, I think that it is clear that in every instance at which Thucydides brings him up, Hermocrates is engaging in this kind of untraditional thought, innovative leadership, innovative, speeches and discussion with his followers. So I think in the sense of each moment that we see him within Thucydides, he is engaging in that kind of intellectual outliership. And I would also say, I do think that Hermocrates probably did see himself as an intellectual outlier. Now, I think he was surely influenced, by the circumstances, time period, and culture that surrounded him. But I wouldn't say that he was simply a product of those things, and I wouldn't say that he thought that he was simply a product of those things either. As a general who wanted Syracuse to triumph over Athens and ascend to greater power than it had held in the past, Hermocrates really needed to consider both the lessons of the past and the possibilities of the future, and he needed to consider them in tandem. He needed to understand what was working for his people strategically and what new methods might work for them. And that required him to draw from his immediate circumstances, but also constantly to cast his mind beyond those circumstances and their conventions, which Thucydides always shows him doing. And I think the situation of the Sicilians in the Peloponnesian War and the broader situation of the war in general really offered Hermocrates a kind of unparalleled opportunity to do this, to engage in this kind of innovation. And he was really able to see that opportunity for what it was and to grasp it. So I would say, yes, he certainly did see himself as an intellectual outlier.
Let me follow up on your last comment about the situation in Sicily and Syracuse. The survival of the collectivity was at stake. Do you think that increased his willingness or courage to be an outlier? And do you think that increased the willingness of the Sicilians to listen to an outlier?
Absolutely, for sure. I think, the pressure of the situation, as it were, I think probably both in Hermocrates' mind and for the Sicilians created opportunities, and it created a willingness to seize those opportunities that I don't think would have been there otherwise. I mean, just to go back to Hermocrates' initial speech to the Sicilians, up until the Peloponnesian War, Sicily was really characterized by these different factions who saw one another as natural enemies. But the fact that this unbelievable threat of Athenian imperialism was looming over them spurred Hermocrates to try to get them to unite, and they agreed to do it despite the customs of the past that they were so used to. So I think for sure the pressure that the war created was a big factor here.
Now let me ask you a question that relates to national security and other situations. Do you think being an outlier with regard to national security is different, let's say, than being an outlier with regard to popular music or with regard to visual arts? Is there something special about threats of national security, about warfare? Are there unique attributes to that, or do you think that there really are? There is a sort of generic aspect to being an outlier?
I mean, I would say yes and no. I think that my answer in part relates to the question that we were just discussing, which is, the opportunities that the circumstances of the Peloponnesian War created. I do think that warfare is a somewhat unique situation in that it brings problems and pressures that most other situations do not. And so I think the circumstances of war can inspire intellectual outliership in ways that maybe many other circumstances wouldn't be able to. But at the same time, I do think that Hermocrates and Thucydides more broadly offers us a possible way to think about intellectual outliership, a possible definition of intellectual outliership, which I would say is something like the ability to learn from your circumstances and from the past, the ability to see opportunities within your circumstances and from the lessons you've learned from the past without being defined by these circumstances and by the customs and traditions and habits that you've always engaged in. And I think that that definition is quite broad and can be applied beyond national security, beyond warfare, certainly, as you mentioned, to the arts, to someone like Leonardo da Vinci, as you discussed in your opening remarks. I think that definition can be applied in many situations, not just national security.
We're getting some questions in the chat, and let me raise one of them. Obstacles. To what extent do we know from Thucydides or other sources, from Hermocrates' own speeches, to what extent do we know what obstacles he faced, what he regarded as the most serious obstacles, what strategies he used to overcome them?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I would say, I think perhaps one of the most serious obstacles that Hermocrates faced, I think he faced an outer obstacle and an inner obstacle. I would say he faced probably two main obstacles. One of the biggest obstacles he faced, I think, was throughout his eventually successful attempts to lead the Sicilians to victory against the Athenians. He was not always met with, perfect agreement from everybody that he talked to. I've used the example of this first speech that he gives to the Sicilians, a speech that was able to kind of break down the barriers of factions in Sicily and unite the Sicilians in a way that they'd never been united before. That speech was successful. But there were times, especially later on in the war, when I think, the Sicilians were starting to grow tired, starting to grow perhaps disillusioned with the ongoing war, that Hermocrates was not as successful in convincing the Sicilians to do exactly what he wanted them to do. There were times when he tried to convince them, for example, to cut the Athenians off at the pass when he knew that the Athenians were approaching Sicily to attack, and the Sicilians did not believe that the Athenians were actually coming in that situation. They were like, no, there's just no way, and we're not going to listen to you, Hermocrates. So he definitely encountered issues with persuasion. It wasn't always smooth sailing for him. And the way in which he faced that obstacle, I would say, was just continuing to try to persuade the Sicilians to do what he thought would be the right course of action, despite whatever failures he had had in the past. He never stopped in his attempts at persuasion. And eventually he did become very successful in leading the Sicilians to defeat the Athenians. And I think another thing I would bring up there that I referenced in my initial remarks is that I think a key tenet of Hermocrates' persuasive abilities and his tenacity in continuing to try with the Sicilians, even when they weren't always listening to him, was that even when the Sicilians didn't believe him, didn't listen to him, he never denigrated them. He never simply told them that they needed to throw out everything that they've been doing, that they needed to just, forget their customs and traditions and do what he said. Always in his persuasion, he combined a respect for the Athenians' cherished beliefs and for what they had been doing already with this kind of gentle prodding toward open-mindedness. So I would say, a perseverance, a tenacity, and a willingness to really meet the Sicilians where they were at every point was how Hermocrates faced that obstacle. And I would quickly note as well, Hermocrates also faced an obstacle within himself. I think Thucydides makes that very clear, which was that Hermocrates had great ambitions. He had ambitions similar to the imperial ambitions of the very Athenians that he was telling the Sicilians were so dangerous and the very Athenians that he was trying to defeat. And he admitted that to his people when he, during his attempts to persuade them to defeat the Athenians. He admitted that in some ways he was not so different from the Athenians in wanting Syracuse to rise to more power than it had ever had before. And so I think that another leader with such ambitions in facing that kind of inner obstacle might have allowed those ambitions to run away with him. But Hermocrates never did. He was always able to keep them in check. And I think the reason that he was able to keep those ambitions in check is that he was constantly admitting those ambitions to his followers, to the people he spoke to. He was always holding himself accountable in a very public way to the people that he spoke to. And so I think, that was a combination of a major outward obstacle and a major inner obstacle kind of plagued Hermocrates throughout his career, I would say, but I think he was able to handle both those obstacles extremely well.
That's a very thoughtful answer. Building on a couple of comments, including one from Tristan Wheat, suppose Hermocrates were alive today. Suppose he came to the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, or to the UN General Assembly, or to the Pentagon, or to Sudan, to Khartoum. What sort of things do you think he would talk about today? What would be on his mind? What would he see as he looked around? And what do you think would be his concerns and wishes or opportunities that he would point to?
Well, first of all, I would love for Hermocrates to come to the UT Austin campus so that I could ask him a few choice questions that are on my mind about his career and his leadership. But yeah, no, it's fascinating to think about. And I think that Hermocrates, I think that the first thing that comes to my mind that he would notice about our current situation. I mean, a lot of locations were named in the question, but in the spirit of not going on for too long, I'll restrict my answer to just, if he came to the US today and what would he think about it. I think he would be struck at as he was struck by the Sicilian factions and the problems that those factions were causing. I think he would be struck by the intense political polarization that exists in the US today. I think he would be struck by the hyperpartisanship that really plagues us these days, and the way that people of different parties can often fall into the trap of thinking of themselves as natural enemies, the same way that people from the different Sicilian factions did. I think that would be the first thing that would strike Hermocrates, especially in the context of the very real and very dangerous external enemies that the US is facing today in our current national security situation. And I think that Hermocrates would have something very similar to say to us that he says to the Sicilians in that first speech about how, you know, despite our differences, we do have a common interest, we do have a common purpose, and it'll be much better for us if we put those things at the forefront of our minds than if we put our differences at the forefront of our minds. And I wish that a Hermocrates could actually come in front of us today and give such a speech. I think it would be very effective.
Let me stay a little bit with this theme of of tribal. Our colleague David Thaler notes that your essay, you talk about shared culture, and the U.S. is often said to be a nation based on an idea where ethnicity matters less. But we have a lot of the sectarianism that you were just mentioning. How do you think Hermocrates or you would balance these issues of, on the one hand, appealing to I'll say the nationalism of the Sicilians, the tribalism against the people from across the water? How does one mix these the sort of shared culture based on an idea like democracy, even for the Athenians, versus just appealing to the tribal or family associations?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very interesting question. And I think to answer it, I would dig a little more deeply into another really important aspect of Hermocrates' first speech to the Sicilians, where, like I've said, he really exhorts them to unite against the Athenians. But Hermocrates walks this incredibly thin line. And I mean, you know, I encourage everybody to read Hermocrates' speeches, especially this one, because it's just amazing rhetorically how he is able to balance these two things. So yes, on one hand, he really appeals to, like I've said, this common interest and common purpose of the Sicilians. And he appeals to the fact that the Athenians are really dangerous. They don't want Athenian imperialism taking over, and they really need to come together to make sure that they defeat the Athenians here. But at the same time, in this very same speech, he talks about the fact that he doesn't, and this, you know, maybe plays into his own very high ambitions. He says that the Sicilians shouldn't blame the Athenians too much. They shouldn't be too angry at the Athenians for what they're trying to do, because, you know, it's for a power like the Athenians, it's only natural to want to enact these kinds of conquests and takeovers that the Athenians are doing. So, even as Hermocrates is exhorting the Sicilians to come together against the Athenians, he's also moderating their retributive spirit. He is saying, even though the Athenians are currently our enemy, that may not necessarily last forever. We're trying to defeat them now, yes. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? There are many elements of the future there that are incalculable, and we shouldn't hold this permanent spirit of retribution in our hearts against anyone. So I think in that way, Hermocrates really does balance the elements that were named in the question, this kind of coming together of this one nation, but also a real appeal to common humanity in general, an appeal to prudence, to moderation, and an appeal against the kind of quick thinking, or well, not quick thinking, but the kind of quick unthinking action that anger and retribution and vengeance can lead to.
In a comment, Tom Earhart has picked up on what you were just saying about Hermocrates also being an outlier for his view that one should be generous to the defeated, not enslave them, and just destroy their livelihoods. But he was much less successful in that regard in persuading his the other Sicilians of this. Do you have any thoughts about why the moment of crisis had passed? Why did his articulate and sensible position on that outlier position not carry so much weight?
And this is, just to be clear, this is the more general appeal to the common humanity. Yeah, I mean, I wish that it had been more successful than it ultimately was. But I think that something else that Thucydides really points to in his overall discussion in the Peloponnesian War, not necessarily just in the portions where he talks about Hermocrates. I think something that Thucydides really brings out is that unfortunately, the spirit of retribution is something that is fundamental to human beings. The spirit of moral indignation, the desire to take vengeance on those that we feel have committed an injustice against us. Examples of that are just, I mean, Thucydides the whole book is rife with examples of that. And of course, examples of that come out particularly well in the kind of wartime situation that Thucydides is writing about. And so I think, with Hermocrates's broader appeal to this kind of moderation, I think Thucydides is showing what a kind of optimal leader, everything that an optimal leader can do to quiet this spirit of retribution as much as possible. And I don't think that Thucydides is simply saying leaders should give up on that and not try to do that at all. But I do think that it is evidenced over and over in the broader scheme of his book that this kind of anger, this kind of indignation is something that is always going to come back no matter what leaders try to do. It's something that's fundamental to human beings. And so in the grand scheme of things, even a leader like Hermocrates, even a leader who can inspire people with his unbelievably good rhetoric at certain moments in history is not going to be able to turn that tide as successfully as maybe we and Thucydides would like it to be turned.
I'd like to come back to the question of creativity in organizations and groups. You've been thinking about this a lot for the last year, and what would you say now about whether it's a think tank or a military? What are some of the policies and practices that you would recommend or point to that could help universities, research groups, brigades allow the people like Hermocrates to come forward?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, in pretty much all of the organizations that you named, I think, it is so easy to just fall into particular patterns without even really realizing it. And of course, you know, to some extent, that's necessary because in order to make these kinds of organizations work, you need to have systems in place that can be followed without too much effort. But of course, as we see in the whole conversation that we've been having and in this case study, problems can really arise when people start to think that these systems are natural in the sense of being somehow fundamental and unchangeable. When you start to become too confident in the systems you have in place, or when you start to think that you could never try something else because, well, we've always done it this way and they've always done it that way, and that's just how it is. So I think that it really is important for any kind of organization to, no matter, you know, you're going to need to have traditions, you're going to need to have customs, you're going to need to have systems that are in place, but it's so important to build some sort of flexibility into these systems, some opportunity, whether that's, you know, a few times a year, every month, whatever you want it to be, some opportunity for people to come together and ask the big questions and talk about the big questions of what is working for us here, what isn't working for us here, what can we do that might actually, you know, allow us to create a more innovative strategy or do something more efficiently or do something better than we've done in the past. And of course, that's really difficult in a lot of ways, because the old ways of doing things may very well be tied to cherished beliefs that you have about yourself or your organization, etc. For a multitude of reasons, people may very well be attached to their old ways of doing things and unwilling to let them go. And so I think in order to counteract that and to allow space for leaders, intellectual outliers like Hermocrates to come to the fore, there need to be these built-in opportunities for people to stop and think, just like Hermocrates makes the Sicilians stop and think, to really ask themselves, what are we doing here that might not be working? What do we need to change about our thinking that we may not want to change, but really will benefit us in the future?
You hinted a little earlier about, I'll say, what happened to Hermocrates after the speech. The rest of his life, he didn't just retire to a beautiful villa overlooking the sea. Tell us a little bit more about his fate. And now we think of you know, we attach glory to him, but he had a difficult life.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, Hermocrates is, in some ways, he is a bit of a shadowy figure. Because, as Jamie said initially, we don't know too much about Hermocrates other than what Thucydides gives us. And yes, as I hinted earlier, the initial speech was very successful. He was not quite as successful at many points later on in the Peloponnesian War. And at one point, he was, soon after being elected to a very high position in the military, he was actually dismissed from his position as general. Because again, the Sicilians weren't always too happy with the advice that he had to give or the things that he had to say. But even after his dismissal, he was still able to advise a little bit, command a little bit, and to help the the Sicilians achieve victory. And closer to the end of the war, again, he continued to face problems. He was eventually placed in exile after a few more events occurred in the Peloponnesian War in which, people didn't exactly like what he was saying or doing. And so he did end up living out the rest of his life in exile until his eventual death. But I'll just note that one other very interesting thing about Hermocrates is that he does appear in the Platonic dialogues Timaeus and Critias, and it might have been, this is questionable, but it's possible that Plato planned a dialogue with the title Hermocrates, in which Hermocrates was going to be a main interlocutor with whatever other characters Plato had planned. So that's just another little tidbit about Hermocrates, another example of the fact that another, dare I say, intellectual outlier, Plato, saw something interesting and valuable about Hermocrates and wanted to write more about him. But it is the case that, we do, at least I do, think of Hermocrates as a somewhat heroic figure now. But he was not always completely successful by many measures, especially towards the end of his life. He was not a completely popular figure in all arenas. He was not a particularly well-loved figure. But it may be that being an intellectual outlier can come with a price, and that price may often be not being as popular and well loved as some other leaders who conform more to the norms of the time.
At the outset, Jamie was mentioning the wonderful paper by Jim March et al. About the Rand Corporation. And of course, outliers like Herman Kahn, for example, certainly had their share of bruises and exiles. And so I think that is certainly part of the story. Well, we're near the end of the hour, and let me turn it back over to Jamie, just noting one more thing before that, which is that there are Sicilians today who claim that the families, the crime families, the mafia families in Sicily actually date their origins continuously back to the resistance, both to the Carthaginians and the Athenians. So it's the depth of some of these feelings obviously runs very deep. Well, I think you've made a great case for past and present, going back to the classics and visiting important contemporary questions through history and wonderful scholarship. So, thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry. So, Emily, Jesse, thank you very much. I mean, this is terrific, Emily. I asked Emily before she started whether she was nervous, and she said no, she actually likes doing this. And I thought, well, that's strange, but anyway, you guys did a terrific job, and I'd like to thank the folks, all the folks for asking questions, terrific questions, and we hope that people like you will continue to follow the foundation and get involved in the experiments that we run. And if you have ideas, don't hesitate to reach out. We are looking for new voices. We are looking for, I think, what Emily, if I took away one word from everything she spoke about in her paper, she used the word untraditional to describe Hermocrates. And I like that word because it describes Emily and Jesse and the other voices that the foundation encourages. So, and anybody can be untraditional if they put their mind to it. So, in closing, I'd like to say that Emily's paper, along with many others, can be found on our website, which is the AndrewWMarshallFoundation.org. A direct link to the paper is also available in the chat, I think. And we're also happy to connect you directly with Emily if you'd like. And so finally, as Emily started, my personal thanks to Stephanie Papa and Lily Dernan for making this happen. I mean, we're a small organization, and what they do with having to deal with me, but also with all the intricacies of running a project like this, along with other projects, is just amazing. And so thank you very much. And Jesse, look forward to seeing you and everybody else. With that, I will say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining.